It's Thursday, the 22nd of November, and time now to join Jon Snow for an extended Channel 4 news special.
Mrs. Thatcher resigns. Heard, Major and Heseltine challenge for the succession. Good evening. Suddenly and unexpectedly, Mrs. Thatcher announces this morning she will not contest the second round of the Tory leadership election. At the palace, she tells the Queen she will resign as Prime Minister as soon as a successor is elected. Douglas Hurd and John Major add their names to that of Michael Heseltine in the ballot to succeed her as Conservative leader. One of the most dramatic days in British politics comes to a crescendo within the Commons this afternoon as Mrs. Thatcher gives a vintage performance defending her government's record in the face of Labour's motion of no confidence. Tonight we report the day's events and analyse why she went, how she went and what happens now. We profile Douglas Hurd, Foreign Secretary. But with no economic portfolio behind him, is he the man to unite the party and lead the country? John Major, Chancellor of the Exchequer, does he have wide enough experience to prove the unifying force? We ask grassroots Conservatives in the constituencies how they see it all now. And where there is discord, may we bring harmony. 11.5 years on, we assess her contribution. After 11.5 years in power, it is all over. Mrs. Thatcher goes to Buckingham Palace to tell the Queen she will not stay on as Prime Minister. A simple Downing Street statement ended the era. I have concluded that the unity of the party and the prospect of victory in a general election would be better served if I stood down. Events this morning moved fast. Her resignation was first flashed on the press wires at 9:37. At 10:30, the party chairman, Kenneth Baker, said the decision was a typically brave and selfless decision. Then at 11:07, the news broke that the Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd was to stand for the leadership. Minutes later, the Chancellor, John Major, also entered the race. At midday, nominations for the second ballot formally closed. Just over half an hour later, Mrs. Thatcher left Downing Street for the palace to tell the Queen formally of her decision. And after all that, Mrs. Thatcher gave a fighting performance in this afternoon's no confidence debate in the Commons. First, our political correspondent, Jane Bennett-Powell, reports on the unfolding events of this morning's drama.
Mrs. Thatcher made her first appearance around 12:30, 5 hours after making her decision and a day after declaring she'd fight on. She left to tell the Queen in person she was standing down from the second leadership ballot. It was yesterday evening Mrs. Thatcher came under the most concerted pressure to step down. A succession of cabinet ministers saw her privately at the Commons, half of them saying she had their backing but she risked defeat in Tuesday's ballot. She returned to work on today's Commons speech with the help of Norman Tebbit and received appeals from several MPs insisting she should stand firm. By 9:30 last night, her mind was apparently and reluctantly made up, and after sleeping on the decision, she told Dennis Thatcher at 7:30 this morning. He made no comment for reporters. Cabinet met at 9 this morning to be told of her conclusion. Kenneth Clarke had apparently said he couldn't continue in the Cabinet if she insisted on standing. There, an intimation of the news to come. Afterwards, a Cabinet minute declared her ministers were united in sadness. That was described as one of the biggest lies ever by a Thatcher supporter. Later, there was backing for what ministers had said last night.
I think what they were saying was, look, you know, we've been loyal to you, we're friends of yours, we think this is all ghastly, but we do have to tell you we don't think you're going to win, and in those circumstances we think that you should stand down. What we do not want to see is you being humiliated by being defeated.
Mrs. Thatcher told her colleagues it was a funny old world, and the party chairman emerged to make a statement.
This is a typically brave and selfless decision by the Prime Minister. Once again, Margaret Thatcher has put her country's and party's interests before personal considerations. This will allow the party to elect a new leader who will unite the party and build upon her immense successes.
Tory backbenchers received the news with sadness, disbelief and surprise.
Well, in every sense, this is disgusted of Basildon. I'm shattered, completely distraught that we've actually removed from office the greatest Prime Minister of this century.
I think it was a pity she didn't resign gracefully when the result of the first round was known. And looking back on it, I think it was a pity she didn't retire when she was on top after 10 very successful years in number 10.
Later, betraying few feelings, the first challenger gave his reaction.
She has made a remarkable contribution to Britain's history and has led this country with great distinction in the 1980s. The resignation about which we just heard now opens the way for an election for the vacancy of leader of the Conservative Party, which will enable others to come forward. I very much welcome that. I would expect my own name to be still there, as it has already been nominated. A way of uniting the Conservative Party and going on to win the next general election.
Of the other possible candidates, Sir Geoffrey Howe, the former Deputy Prime Minister, said he wouldn't stand. But the Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary have thrown their caps into the ring.
The Prime Minister announced a very sad decision this morning. I believe the overriding need now is for the Conservative Party to find a leader who can unite it in handling present problems and in winning the next general election.
The opposition welcomed the decision.
She was right to go, but the underlying political situation hasn't changed. The government's in terminal decline, and no successor can make it an effective government again. What this country now needs and ought to have is a quick general election.
For Mr Heseltine, who'd consulted colleagues at Westminster this morning, the next round was in his sights. For Mrs Thatcher, back from her audience with the Queen, the closing chapters of her leadership were being prepared.
Jane Bennett-Powell reporting. Mrs Thatcher spent the afternoon in the House of Commons giving a vigorous defence of her government's record against a motion of no confidence from the Labour Party. Neil Kinnock accused her of 11 years of misrule and said Tory divisions were now basic and unbridgeable. But despite the circumstances, Mrs Thatcher came out fighting in what many MPs consider to be vintage style, standing by the policy on Europe that had caused her downfall. Our political editor Eleanor Goodman was in the Commons for the Prime Minister's performance.
Mrs Thatcher left Downing Street refusing to speak to the media massed for the downfall of this, once the most dominant of British Prime Ministers.
Prime Minister, the end of an era.
The woman who has earned herself so many places in the history books today had the humiliating distinction of becoming the first Prime Minister to face a no-confidence motion in the Commons, having already announced their resignation. Outside Westminster, there was some comfort from the crowds, who cheered in a faint reminder of her election triumphs. As soon as she entered the chamber, her party rose to cheer her. Some of those waving ballot papers must have voted against her, but nearly all sympathised with her now. By cruel irony, the first Conservative with a question on the order paper was one of those who had publicly turned against her. But today he came not to bury the Prime Minister, but praise her.
This is a time of sadness and happiness. Sadness for her from the great well of affection that exists throughout the House. Happiness in celebration of what has been, is, and will remain the greatest peacetime political reign of this century.
Mr. Speaker, may I thank my honourable friend. The same person in a slightly different capacity will be available to serve Britain in whatsoever way it happens.
Mrs Thatcher clearly wanted to get over the message that she didn't intend going into complete retirement and would continue to express her views. Even more galling for the Prime Minister, Neil Kinnock then offered his sympathies.
May I pay tribute to the Prime Minister and to her decision this morning. She showed by that she amounts to more than those who have turned upon her in recent days. Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady, I know, considers the principle of choice to be extremely important, and that is rightly so. Does she agree with me that the people of Britain should now be given the power of choice in a general election?
Mr. Speaker, may I thank the right honourable gentleman for his earlier comments. In reply to his later question, the answer is no, no more than we had an election when Mr. Wilson changed to Mr. Callaghan.
Paddy Ashdown also began with praise, but ended with a barb, which Mrs. Thatcher managed to answer with a joke.
No one can doubt the special style she's brought to that dispatch box, nor her courage, conviction and determination that she has brought to her premiership. Mr. Speaker, perhaps I might ask her to use this opportunity to offer to the House any advice she might have for her successor.
Apart from the last bit, may I thank the right honourable gentleman for his kindness. May I remind the House that I expect to be here on Tuesday afternoon and possibly even on Thursday afternoon. So I hope the House will be as kind then as it is today.
What Mrs. Thatcher dreaded most was sympathy from her friends, for she feared the emotion would be too much for her, and it nearly was.
Will my right honourable friend accept from me the love and affection of millions of people in my part of the world who have looked to her over these years with the greatest admiration and delight?
Yeah. I'm particularly grateful to receive that from my honourable friend. We were at college together, and I think have been together ever since.
She recovered thanks to a hostile question from a Labour backbencher, listing his constituents' complaints, which allowed her to come out fighting.
Is she aware that they are desperately worried about poll tax, about the deepening recession, about the health service? They are worried about the educational system and about the whole Tory shambles.
Well, the honourable gentleman always was quite a good advocate. He could speak to any brief, and I don't believe he believed a word of that.
We now come to the no confidence motion.
For the full no confidence debate, the Cabinet lined up beside the Prime Minister. Neil Kinnock had originally called for it partly in the hope of cementing Mrs. Thatcher's position. But he also wanted to use it to demonstrate that the Conservatives were no longer fit to govern.
Mr. Speaker, as the months have passed, we've seen all of the signs of division and decay within the government. As ex-ministers have testified, the government is riddled with distrust, just as the party opposite is racked by disagreement which cannot be healed under any leader at any time. The British people know that, Mr. Speaker, and that is why they have rejected the Conservative Party in every political test and will go on rejecting that party.
And he mocked Tory MPs for only rebelling against Mrs. Thatcher when their own seats were at risk.
There was no panic, no demand for the Prime Minister to go when wards were closing in hospitals and schools were crumbling. They weren't striving to topple the Prime Minister when unemployment went over 3 million, or when the crushing mortgages were imposed, or when poverty has been spreading. No rebellions, no panic, no demands for the Prime Minister to go. The only time that the party opposite ever summoned up the strength of self-interest to take action was when they saw their own political careers in danger of being terminated.
Clearly conscious of how much more popular the Tories might be under the leadership of Michael Heseltine, Neil Kinnock attacked his promise to reform the poll tax. Then he turned to Europe, claiming it was impossible for the Conservatives to unite on this critical issue. But he was interrupted by one of Mrs. Thatcher's fiercest critics as he spelt out his objectives for Europe.
One is to ensure that there is in that community, in that development of greater cohesion, in that integration, in that union, a much greater... Oh, yes. They don't like it. Of course they don't like it. They haven't got a policy.
Assuming that there is a single European central bank which is accountable, is he saying that he and his party favour a single currency issued by a single European bank responsible for a single monetary policy?
Yes or no?
Yes or no?
As the right honourable gentleman will know, there is no yes and no answer now to that question.
The Tories, with their backs to the wall, repeatedly tried to knock Mr. Kinnock off his stride. But at the end, the Labour leader returned to the central issue of whether people could trust such a divided government.
How can anyone, Mr. Speaker, have confidence in a government whose former Deputy Prime Minister admits that they have been pursuing the wrong policies for half a decade? Who can have confidence in a government with cabinet ministers who in the last week have been privately telling the press that the Prime Minister is finished, and then minutes later supporting her position in the television studio before going off to a private meeting in order to contrive the coup against the Prime Minister? In a democracy, there should be one fitting conclusion to today's dramatic events: a general election. Mr. Speaker, let the people decide. Let Britain have a fresh chance with a Labour government.
When Mrs Thatcher rose for what must have been the biggest ordeal of her life, there was another demonstration of support for her. She began by acknowledging the opposition's right to hold the debate, but immediately went on to the attack, accusing Mr Kinnock of trying to exploit the leadership contest.
A democratic election according to rules which have been public knowledge for many years, one member, one vote. A far cry from the way the opposition do these things. 2 in every 5 votes for their leader are cast by the trade union block votes, which has a bigger say than do honourable members opposite in that decision. Precious little democracy there.
She then used her speech to send a message to those taking part in that election to succeed her.
The real issue to be decided by my right honourable and honourable friends is how best to build on the achievements of the 1980s. How to carry Conservative policies through to the 90s. How to add to 3 general election victories a 4th, which we shall surely win. Look at that!
But the strain showed as she repeated the arguments against Labour she has made so often.
Labour oppose our new rents to mortgage initiative that will spread the benefits of ownership wider still. And we've done it by giving people choice in public services. Which school is right for their children? Which training course is best for the school leaver? Which doctor they choose to look after their health, and which hospital they want for their treatment.
But Mrs Thatcher is nothing if not a fighter, and she came back off the ropes when a Labour MP asked the obvious question.
If things are quite so good as the Prime Minister is outlining today, why aren't all her colleagues behind her happy to have her continue in the job of defending that record?
Mr Speaker, these are the reasons why we shall win a 4th general election. We have been down in the polls before when we've taken difficult decisions. The essence of a good government is that it is prepared to take difficult decisions to get the long-term prosperity. That is what we have achieved, and that is why we shall win handsomely when a general election comes.
She fought back again when a Liberal Democrat challenged her record on the poor.
How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer off, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979? Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is the Liberal policy. Yes, it came out, he didn't intend it to, but he did.
It was almost as if she'd forgotten she'd had to resign, as she repeated her personal credo. And when a Labour left-winger suggested in an aside that she might like to take over the governorship of the European Central Bank, she managed a joke.
No, she's going to be the governor.
On the present structure...
Prime Minister.
What a good idea. I hadn't thought of it. But if I were, there'd be no European Central Bank accountable to no one, least of all to national parliaments. Because the point of that kind of European Central Bank is no democracy, taking powers away from every single parliament and being able to have a single currency and a monetary policy and an interest rate which takes all political power away from us. As my right honourable friend said in his first speech after the proposal of a single currency is about the politics of Europe. It is about a federal Europe by the back door. So I'll consider the honourable gentleman's proposal. Now, where were we? I'm enjoying this.
But the laughter died away as she offered her final testimony.
It is because we on this side have never flinched from difficult decisions that this House and this country can have confidence in this government today.
Once again, the party which had forced her to resign rose to its feet. As one said afterwards, it had been like watching a lioness fighting to the end. Eleanor Goodman, ITN, Westminster.
After the break in this specially extended Channel 4 news, and then there were three. Mr. Major is fond of the sport that's providing most of the current political metaphors, but is he a safe pair of hands? Mr. Hurd is a friend of his and the two are close politically. So why are they standing against each other in the race for number 10?
For more information on the Procon 10 safety system, phone Audi on 0800 585 685.
My family was poor, but Mama's tortilla chips were the most delicious in all Mexico. They brought her great wealth. She bought a jacuzzi, but disaster. The Ministry of Cruel but Fair Trading discovered she imported her tortilla chips from Medomsley Road, Consett, in County Durham. Now she lives in abject poverty with only a Pat Boone record for company. Aye, aye, aye. Oh, oh, oh.
Pay attention, Phileas Fogg, authentic snacks made in Medomsley Road, Consett.
You know, of course, that Santa Claus lives
in Lapland.
In Lapland, yes, exactly. Well, because Clever Daddy's won a contest, we're going to see him in Lapland. And we're going there on Concorde.
This Christmas, there are 1,000 Concorde seats to be won to Lapland. Just fly British Airways Intercontinental returning by December the 13th.
I don't believe in Concorde.
It's absolutely true. You, your family and friends could be travelling to Lapland on Concorde. Take a modern telephone. Add an answer phone. Then add a fax machine, all operating through a single phone line. Make it Mercury compatible for lower phone bills. And include a 12-month on-site warranty. The result is the Amstrad fax, with £100 off if you trade in a telephone or an answer phone.
Welcome back to this special extended edition of Channel 4 News following Mrs Thatcher's announcement that she is to resign as Prime Minister as soon as a new leader of the Conservative Party is elected. The contest to succeed her as Prime Minister and leader of the party is now between Douglas Hurd, John Major and Michael Heseltine. Voting in the second ballot takes place on Tuesday, and to win outright, a candidate needs a simple majority of Conservative MPs. That's 187 votes. If all three fall short and stay in the race, there'll be a third round of voting 2 days later on Thursday. MPs will then cast a single transferable vote. If no one gains an absolute majority, the lowest placed drops out, his votes will be redistributed, and a winner will emerge by simple majority. In terms of policy, little now appears to divide the three contenders for the Conservative Party leadership. Mr Hurd, Mr Major and Mr Heseltine are all in favour of closer ties with Europe, though some on the right say Mr Major might have become too pro-European for them. On economic policy, there are differences. Mr Hurd is thought to be relatively inexperienced. Mr Major is already admired for his caution over interest rates and inflation. Mr Heseltine may have trouble with the right because he's in favour of some government intervention in the free market. On poll tax, Mr Hurd and Mr Major have so far supported the government line. Mr Heseltine wants a complete revision. On home and social issues, Mr Hurd is seen to have been a tough Home Secretary, and that may appeal to the right. Mr Major is thought to be something of a liberal. Mr Heseltine has pinned his banner to what he calls caring capitalism. Mr Hurd may be helped by his image as a senior Conservative of considerable stature who could unite the party. Mr Major may be helped by his relative youth and talent. Mr Heseltine by his appeal to the electorate. The Foreign Secretary is, at 60, the oldest and most experienced man in the race. He's been proposed by Tom King, the Defence Secretary, and seconded by Chris Patten, the Environment Secretary. Of other Cabinet colleagues, Mr Clark, Mr Waldegrave and Mr Rifkind have announced tonight that they support him. Ian Ross reports on Mr Hurd's background and thinking.
No one in the last few days could accuse Douglas Hurd of being nakedly ambitious to succeed Mrs Thatcher, and he kept on saying he wouldn't stand against her. Indeed, not long ago, when Mrs Thatcher looked fairly secure, he dismissed the whole idea of becoming PM.
By the time there is a vacancy, the party will quite rightly want someone younger than I am.
But if it was offered?
It won't be offered. I don't, and actually, you know, I have, 10 more years of active life. I have other ideas for them.
Douglas Richard Hurd, elder son of Baron Hurd, was clever right from junior school. At Eton he was a scholar, captain of school, and took an active part in the wall game. At Cambridge he took a first-class degree and became President of the Union. He was ably qualified for his first choice of career as a diplomat. But by 1968 he had left diplomacy for politics, becoming political secretary to Edward Heath. He entered Parliament in the same year, 1974, as Heath lost the general election. Hurd had to wait until 1984, 5 years after the Tories returned to power, for his first cabinet job in Northern Ireland. He was competent, but not there long enough to make any real mark, and the following year he was switched to the Home Office. At Handsworth and Birmingham he saw at first hand rioting in the streets and the breakdown, albeit temporarily, of law and order. Showing coolness under attack, he refused to accept that it was justified by poverty, bad housing and unemployment, proving to the right in his party that he was an acceptably dry Home Secretary. September this year, Foreign Secretary Hurd, his wife and the Genshers at Glyndebourne. British and German Foreign Secretaries in perfect harmony, and Hurd himself clearly in tune with the job in which he's always looked very comfortable. Hurd didn't expect the Foreign Office. It fell to him as a result of Nigel Lawson's resignation. But in the year he's been there, he's reckoned to have handled himself well over German unification and the new order in Europe, and to have shown diplomatic skill combined with firmness on the crisis in the Gulf. Long before today, he was being talked of as the compromise candidate who might bring harmony where there was discord. Hurd's politics are probably best described as one-nation Tory rather than free market ideologue. In his book on the Heath years, he defended government intervention in time of economic crisis, saying it is most unlikely to use the argument that it can do nothing because its ideology says nothing can be done. On social policy, he's prepared to be tough. As Home Secretary, he pushed through the Official Secrets Act and the forced repatriation of the Vietnamese boat people. On the more controversial aspects of economic policy, interest rates, poll tax, he's stuck to the cabinet brief, but the right suspect that he's a trifle unsound. But it's on Europe that Hurd's influence on government policy would be most apparent. In the way they see Britain's closer integration into the European community, he and Sir Geoffrey Howe were at one. Hurd didn't think Howe should have resigned over European policy, and he's used the same kind of language as the former Foreign Secretary.
No one is seriously expecting Britain to submerge our Parliament, our other basic institutions, into a federal state on either the American or the German model. It's not some dread conspiracy against us, it's just an argument.
The old town of Witney in Oxfordshire, where the blankets are made, is Douglas Hurd's constituency. Hurd, the constituency MP, is no barnstorming politician. Even his best friends wouldn't claim that the 60-year-old ex-diplomat has the charisma of Heseltine or the bustle of Mrs. Thatcher. He appears a little cool, but good under pressure.
From my knowledge of him, having worked very closely with him in a number of crises, he is one of those people who, the more pressure you put on him, the better he is. And he will also unite the party, which is a crucial factor at the moment.
Wouldn't John Major?
I think John is an admirable candidate too. The whole purpose of the Prime Minister's courage in standing down was to allow the two best candidates out of the Cabinet now to stand. And they're close friends, and it's very difficult for the rest of us to choose between them. My own view is that by voting for Douglas you can get both, because why shouldn't John be Prime Minister in 10 years' time?
In 10 years' time, Douglas Hurd will be 70. He is, if it matters, the oldest of the contenders.
Ian Ross reporting. Well, I'm joined now live from Westminster by the Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd. Mr. Hurd, first, you've been very close to the Prime Minister in the last few days, particularly in Paris. What's your reaction to her going?
Well, I've never admired her more than I have in the last few days. I was in Paris with her. I saw her at the conference. She saw Bush, she saw Gorbachev, she saw Kohl, she saw Mitterrand, and she carried herself, even on that agonizing night after the news was bad, and we had this enormous dinner at Versailles, she carried herself with extraordinary dignity and good cheer, and you could see that even people who criticized her in the past were feeling for her. It was an extraordinary sensation that night, and indeed yesterday morning.
Well, now we have to look forward. You and John Major are close allies, close colleagues. Why couldn't you sort it out and decide between you which should go forward to challenge Mr. Heseltine?
Well, I suppose we could have gone into some smoke-filled room and done that, but we thought it was really simpler and better to let the Conservative members of Parliament decide. We've worked closely, particularly in the last year, and we'll work closely again, I don't doubt that. It's a question of which of us is better able to unite the party. We can't go on like this. These divisions are disastrous. And what Conservatives all over the country are now pouring in and saying is you've got to get this right. You've got to heal these wounds before they turn poisonous.
Well, now, as you saw in your profile that we just ran just there, you said to me only back in October, look, I'm reluctant on the leadership. I've got better things to do for the next 10 years.
Yeah, and Michael Heseltine was saying he'd never challenge. The truth is that things have changed. I was talking about the Prime Minister retiring sometime in the next Parliament, when obviously somebody younger would be chosen. I don't think any of us conceived the present tragedy.
Now, no one questions your wide international experience, and you were a diplomat, you have been at the Foreign Office, you've been at the Home Office, but you've never had an economic portfolio. Is that a disadvantage, running against a Chancellor?
I don't think it is. After all, I've sat in Cabinet, for 6 years now. I've listened, I've taken part in many, many economic discussions, and I think I know the ropes of that. I think also I would have a very good Chancellor.
And how will you go about healing the party? Now, if you do win, will you bring in, for example, your two fellow candidates?
Well, I'm not going to be very presumptuous to start dishing out portfolios. We're not in that position. But obviously, unity of the party is essential. Now, there have been times when the party's been split on some great matter of policy. Some people run around pretending now that there is such a split on Europe. There isn't. There isn't. There is a policy, a government policy, which we're pursuing, on which I think 80-90% of Conservative MPs are content.
Michael Heseltine has touched a nerve on the back benches by talking about the poll tax, a radical revision, even the possibility of getting rid of it. You seem to be more, well, you've been in line with the Cabinet.
What do you expect? But of course I know from my own patch in West Oxfordshire that the poll tax has been very unpopular. And that is why in Cabinet we have worked out ways of improving it, doing away with the safety net contribution as a burden on the charge payer, for example, improving the position of the people who live over the shop. Many other changes of that kind. I think we should always be on the lookout for further changes to make it more workable. What I don't think is sensible is, because there's a leadership election, to go around from studio to studio inventing policy on the hoof. That's the kind of thing that gets Neil Kinnock into such trouble.
In the country, do you think more compassion, more caring is required?
I think more persuasion is required. We're coming up to a general election. I think we've got to practice persuasion rather than assertion. We've got to show that we listen and understand. Then we've got to take the necessary decisions. And then we've got to persuade people, quietly, firmly, that what we've decided is right.
Douglas Hurd, Foreign Secretary, thank you very much indeed for joining us. The Chancellor, John Major, at 47, the youngest of the three challengers, has been in the Cabinet just 3 years. His proposer is the Agriculture Secretary, John Gummer. His seconder, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Norman Lamont. Of other Cabinet colleagues, Mr Lilly and Mr Howard have announced tonight they support him. Ian Williams examines Mr Major's credentials for a move from number 11 to number 10 Downing Street.
Meteoric is the term most often used to describe the rise of John Major. His reception at last month's Tory conference underlined his standing with the party faithful. The Chancellor was hailed as a great unifier, having overcome the Prime Minister's objections and taken Britain into Europe's exchange rate mechanism, cutting interest rates in the process. Outside the party, among the public, he's one of the least well-known members of the Cabinet. His sheer ordinariness has won him the labels of the grey man of politics and Mr Nice Guy, not the stuff many feel of which leaders are made.
He comes in untried and with a very brief experience as Chancellor and a very extremely brief experience as Foreign Secretary, and there would be a period of time in which he would have to earn his credibility. I think it would be a mistake to underestimate his ability to do just that. He's a quiet, persevering man who gets things done in his own way, and he is in no way a nothing.
Mr Major was first elected to Parliament in 1979 and never looked back. He was appointed to the Whip's office in 1983 and 2 years later became a junior Social Security Minister. He came to the attention of Mrs Thatcher during the 1987 election campaign. After the election, he joined Nigel Lawson at the Treasury, where, as Chief Secretary, his tough control of the purse strings first endeared him to the Tory right. He was appointed Foreign Secretary when Sir Geoffrey Howe was relieved of the post in July 1989, but just 3 months later was catapulted to the Treasury after the resignation of his erstwhile colleague, Mr Lawson. The leadership battle has been thick with cricketing metaphors. But Mr Major is a devotee of the real thing, as he demonstrated at this photo call before the budget. Open though he appears with the press, he has kept his guard when it comes to political labels. And while the right has adopted him as an economic dry, he's liberal on social issues, a product perhaps of his own modest upbringing, leaving school at 16, the son of an unemployed trapeze artist. That with a personal manner that draws different reactions.
He lacks the personal vanity, which almost all politicians have to drive them forward. He would be the most modest leader, most modest Prime Minister, since Attlee. He is a man who is very, very easy for other people to deal with and to like, universally popular, I think, with his colleagues, moderate in his views. That could be quite attractive to the country.
If he has a character, I wouldn't say a defect, but a character aspect that people would have to look at, is that he very much wants to be liked. Now, Margaret Thatcher was the opposite kind of leader. She didn't mind if she was liked or not, or she hasn't minded that. That can be a disadvantage.
But it's on Mr Major's European views that Tory Eurosceptics pin much hope. In spite of his embrace of the ERM and his proposals for a European currency, the hard ecu, to circulate alongside existing currencies, sceptics say he remains a European critic. At the Tory conference, he made clear his suspicion of rapid moves towards integration.
Joining the exchange rate mechanism does not mean that we are on a road leading inexorably to a single currency. It does demonstrate yet again that we take our commitment to Europe seriously and that we mean what we say. But we also mean it when we say that we cannot accept the Delors plan.
But Lord Rees-Mogg thinks the Eurosceptics are reading too much into that.
No, I think he's pragmatic in his approach to Europe, cautious, sensible, but willing to accept the logic of the European situation, and that means that the anti-Europeans would find him probably a disappointment.
From his position in one of the great offices of state, Mr. Major knows that at 47 he appeals to those wanting the leadership to jump a generation. But his colleagues will be wondering if being solid, competent and likeable is enough to win power in the party, and after that in the country.
Ian Williams. I spoke to the Chancellor from Westminster a short time ago, and I asked him first why both he and Mr. Hurd were now standing.
Well, I'm sure we could have done that, but don't you think that is a decision for the parliamentary party to take? All Douglas and I have done is said to the parliamentary party that it is for them to make the choice as to whom they would like as their next leader. I think that is a perfectly proper thing to do, and I have no doubt we will have a very amicable series of discussions and decisions over the next few days.
If there is a choice, then where do you differ from Douglas Hurd?
Well, I'm not going to pick a whole series of areas where I differ either with Douglas Hurd or with Michael Heseltine. I'm perfectly content to tell you what I stand for and what I believe in, but I'm certainly not going to contribute to points of disagreement.
One of the things that people have said is that whilst you have some proven experience, obviously, in economic matters, and a very small period as Foreign Secretary, your wider experience is limited.
Well, I'm sure people may say that. That is one of the matters they will have to weigh in the judgment when they make up their minds. But of course they will equally have to weigh that in their minds when they decide at the next general election, when, were I to be Conservative Party leader, I would be opposing Mr. Kinnock, who has no experience whatsoever, either at home or abroad, in any elected office.
Well, now, let's look at what you stand for. There are some on the right of the party who think that you could be their standard bearer, yet some of your team are rather on the left of the party. Where are you?
Well, I think that is the point about the situation in which we find ourselves. I very much want to see the Conservative Party win the next general election and become demonstrably a unified party with a unified series of policies. You are precisely right. Those people who have indicated their support to me come from all strands of the party, all backgrounds in the party, both experienced and inexperienced, and those who fall in the middle. It is a very wide strand indeed, and we hope it will appeal.
Has it all come a bit earlier than you'd have wished?
Well, these things never come precisely when you expect them, but there you are. You must take events as they are and deal with them.
Mr. Heseltine was very quick to produce, in essence, a manifesto, the core of which was a thorough review of the poll tax. Where are you on the poll tax?
I will be dealing with all these things over the period of the next few days, but I will deal with them in my own time and my own way so that people are perfectly clear what my policies are.
It has to be accepted events have moved remarkably fast. Could I perhaps go back to the moment before you decided to run? Were you one of those who advised the Prime Minister that perhaps it probably was best if she didn't enter the second round?
I had in fact signed the Prime Minister's nomination form as the candidate for the second round. I think the Prime Minister has been a very remarkable Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister had decided she wished to go on, then she would have had my full support in doing so.
Do you think that you would handle Europe in any different way from the way in which she has?
Insofar as whether we can negotiate our way to a satisfactory conclusion with our European partners, yes. I don't have a shred of doubt that we will be able to negotiate an agreement with our European partners that is satisfactory to our colleagues in the House of Commons and the country, and that latter point is immensely important.
Now, when we look at the other candidates in the field, particularly at Michael Heseltine, there are those who are saying he's a man with charisma, he's a man who's toiled virtually all his working life for this. There are those who say that the opinion polls do not describe you in similar terms, that perhaps you lack charisma and recognition.
Well, that may be the case. I am not going to comment on what opinion polls say. They are sometimes accurate, they are sometimes inaccurate, and sometimes their judgments evolve over a period of time, perhaps sometimes rather a short period of time. But the decision that has to be made by 372 of my parliamentary colleagues. They know Michael well, they know Douglas well, and they know me well, and I'm content to await their judgment next week.
What, finally, Mr. Major, do you credit your meteoric rise to this position to?
I don't think I'm the best person to make that judgment. I do believe that if one works hard and pursues what one wants, then sometimes one is successful. That has been a credo I have tended to follow.
And your mood tonight in terms of the realistic chances of winning?
Oh, I think there's a very realistic chance of winning. We have had a very considerable amount of support for a candidacy that was not preordained, not pre-announced, and that has only become known to my parliamentary colleagues over the period of the last few hours. So we are very encouraged indeed by the tremendous amount of support we've had from all strands of the party over the period of the last few hours.
John Major. Well, I'm joined now from Westminster by the former Tory party chairman Norman Tebbit for what is your first public statement since Mrs Thatcher resigned. Now, before we come to who you may endorse further on, let me first take you back to your rather spirited contribution last night on this programme, Mr Tebbit, when you said, look, we've had a look at this and we think that the Prime Minister is the best person to go on and lead the party and win the election. She's gone. Why?
I would think you would have to ask her that. I still believe, as I believed last night, that she would have been the best person to have gone on and to have won this election contest. I think what's more, after her performance in the House of Commons today, that there may be very, very many more people inside and outside the Palace of Westminster who would agree with me.
Now, some people were saying, watch out on the outside rails, we could find Norman Tebbit standing in this round. You're not. Who are you going to back?
Well, I didn't want to be a spoiler, and I concluded that it would be very foolish of me to think that I could carry a greater measure of support than the Prime Minister. And if the conclusion had been reached that she wasn't going to make it, hell, I wasn't going to either, because I'm very much like her, would appeal to the same sort of constituency. So I sat down and decided, although a lot of people had asked me to stand and I'd got over 80 pledged votes, that I ought to think about the best interest of the party and the country above all. And it seemed to me that what we needed was a candidate who could best unite the party, who could best draw support from the left and the right, and someone also who could speak in the accents and the style which would have electoral appeal to the ordinary voter, the ordinary man and woman in the street. And I cast around and talked to my colleagues in the House of Commons, and that's what I've been doing all day. And my conclusion is that the best candidate, by far, is John Major.
You're not concerned then by the liberal label that has been attached to his domestic political attitudes, I mean attitudes towards social welfare and the rest?
No, I'm not. I might disagree with John about some things, and I'm not going to try and sell him as a sort of male Thatcher clone.
Or a Tebbit clone.
Pardon?
Or indeed a Tebbit clone.
No, that's right. That would not be right, it would not be accurate, and I don't think it would be helpful. I think that John is above all an economic dry. He's a very straight, tough chancellor, and we've seen that. I think on social issues, some of them, he's a bit more liberal than I am. But I think sometimes, at times, you've perhaps misunderstood me just a little bit. Not very much, but just a little bit. I was, after all, the guy that introduced the youth training scheme and community work and things of that kind. But having said that, I think that John's view on social affairs, social welfare, would be that I don't think he's ashamed of the amount of money we spend on it. I think he may have his doubts at times, as I do, about the exact ways in which we spend it, some of which I think are counterproductive, and he will of course have to speak for himself about that.
You have a very determined view about Europe. Do you think he will stick to that kind of a view?
I am a pro-European, and that's why I get very cross with people who tried to create some sort of argument which suggested that people like me are anti-European. We're not. We believe very strongly in increasing collaboration and a much more closely knit Europe, but still a Europe of nation states. Now the key in all that is the question of the single currency, and that is one where I think that John's view and mine would be the same, That is, that if you have a single currency, you have a single Chancellor of the Exchequer for the whole of Europe. I think he and I find that very difficult to accept, because we cannot see any way in which the proper democratic machinery could be made to work.
One final brief question, Mr. Tebbit. Whichever of the three men wins, will you continue to serve the party?
I hope I will always serve the party. I think that it will be very much easier for the party to heal its wounds if the successful candidate in this election, the next Conservative Prime Minister, is not the man who really precipitated this, what I think was a dreadful mistake of dumping the Prime Minister.
Norman Tebbit, thank you very much indeed for joining us. After the break, who the Tory voters are backing in the three-horse race. Down in Bexley-Heath, they wanted to sack their MP for supporting Mr Heseltine. Today, some of them were in tears. Plus, as the constituencies make up their own minds, we talked to three backbench MPs about the way they'll vote now Mrs Thatcher has gone.
At night I dream of many things, some of which I plan and save for, some of which I achieve. When I was young, I wanted to see Africa, to run away. And so I traveled, but never left. My dream changed. I became us, became a family. And while dazzling things dazzle me still, my values hold dear other dreams. My home, my daughter's freedom to be, to achieve. My life with the man I still love. Simple dreams I dream. At night, during the day.
Would you voyage into the horizon, seeking new ways to shape tomorrow? That's what we're busy with at DSM. DSM. We put fantasy to work.
From November the 28th, prospectuses for the 12 regional electricity company share offers will be available from post offices and most banks.
Offers close 10 a.m. December the 5th. You could buy into what you plug into.
I'm captivated by the magic of Hong Kong. I came here 8 years ago and fell in love with this great city. The cultures of East and West, past and present, become fused into one. The only constant is change. Every day I discover something new. That's why I've never left.
Come and discover your Hong Kong, the holiday of a lifetime.
Welcome back to this specially extended edition of Channel 4 News following Mrs Thatcher's decision to resign as Tory party leader and Prime Minister. The Tory party chairman, Kenneth Baker, has appealed to all constituency party leaders to unite for the sake of the Conservative Party. He said their priorities should be to attack Labour and win the next general election. Conservative MPs will now be consulting their local parties on which way to vote in the second round of the leadership contest. Lindsay Taylor has been gauging reaction at the Bexley-Heath Conservative Club. Mrs Thatcher resigns, leaving Douglas Hurd and John Major to fight Michael Heseltine for the succession.
At Bexley-Heath Conservative Club, members watched the news of Mrs Thatcher's resignation in something of a state of shock.
Good afternoon. Mrs. Thatcher's sudden and unexpected resignation this morning.
Although stunned, not all were actually surprised, and the reactions to the announcement were mixed.
Very sad that she couldn't go with a little more dignity to go with her standing. She's been so marvellous.
I was very disappointed that she decided to throw her hand in after declaring that she would fight to the death.
Well, I think it was time. Time for her to go. I mean, she has been marvellous, but it's time now. There was disunity in the party, and I think she would have made it worse.
Nearly everyone here at the club paid tribute to Mrs. Thatcher's achievements. On the streets among the constituents, opinions were again divided.
Terrible. I think she's done a good job. Good. I'm pleased that she's resigned. I'm like that at the minute. You know, part and part. I don't think she was that bad, really.
At the Conservative Association headquarters, by lunchtime they'd taken some 70 calls from upset Tory supporters.
Terrible shame.
In fact, one or two ladies were actually in tears. I mean,
Callers condemned the local MP, Cyril Townsend, for his support of Michael Heseltine. Already there'd been speculation about his future as candidate at the next election, so would there be recriminations now?
Well, there are recriminations, but it's my job to calm those recriminations. And those people who are writing in saying they're going to resign, I ask them to reflect again, because the party here needs their support.
And Mr. Townsend is not changing his mind.
He said yes, he's going to continue to vote for Michael Heseltine. Although at that time, to be fair, only Douglas Hurd had been nominated and not John Major, but I don't think that will change his mind.
Mrs. Thatcher's portrait will not lose its pride of position here, taking her place in history with Winston Churchill. Now, though, thoughts are inevitably turning to the next Tory leader.
Well, I started out thinking about Mr. Heseltine, but now there's other people in it. I'd like to see Mr. Major get it.
John Major, providing he's got parliamentary experience behind him. Otherwise, I think that it must be Mr. Hurd.
I'd like to see Mr. Hurd.
Michael Heseltine.
I think Heseltine.
As long as it's not Mr. Heseltine.
Anybody that can beat the Labour Party.
In the next few days, here as everywhere, the speculation will be rife about just who will be the next leader of the Conservative Party. But tonight, many here, of all political persuasions, find it hard to take in that soon the words Mrs. Thatcher will no longer mean Prime Minister. Lindsay Taylor, ITN, Bexley Heath.
The picture from the grassroots. Well, now let's go down to Downing Street, where the Prime Minister is due to leave for a further engagement tonight. Her car is at the door. Should she depart, and indeed should she come over to our cameras and say anything in the course of the programme, we will of course return there. But we're joined now from Westminster by three Conservative MPs: Timothy Raisin, who abstained in the first vote on the leadership election; Emma Nicholson, who voted for Mr. Heseltine in the first ballot; and Alan Clark, who as a minister backed Mrs. Thatcher. Could I ask you first, Timothy Raisin, because you were with us last night on Channel 4 News. At that stage you were undecided, but clearly Mrs. Thatcher was still very much in the race. How has her departure affected the way you're thinking?
Well, I wasn't undecided last night. I was committed all through to Douglas Hurd if he would stand. Of course, I didn't know last night that he was going to stand, but I abstained because I wanted Douglas Hurd. What's happened, of course, is traumatic, but I believe in Douglas Hurd. We've got somebody who's got the enormous width of experience and wisdom to take us through these problems in Europe, the Gulf, and so on, and somebody who's got the capacity to unite the party. I'm sure that everybody, if he is chosen, will work for him very hard, and he will be much the least divisive figure. The mood will be against divisiveness anyway. The party wants to unite, but I think Douglas Hurd encapsulates that best.
Emma Nicholson, you made one of the most public commitments in the course of the campaign to Michael Heseltine. You're going to stick with him?
I believe that Michael Heseltine will make a very good future Prime Minister. I shall, however, be looking very carefully indeed at the manifestos of the other two candidates. It's a fascinating new game. We've got three first-class candidates coming forward for the leadership of the Conservative Party. Mind you, there are many more in the wings. But I must look very carefully indeed at what John Major and Douglas Hurd have to offer. But they will have to go far to match up to the already marvellous manifesto put forward by Michael Heseltine, which was the reason that I backed him.
You've had a bumpy time from some of your constituency officials. You're going to be seeing them this weekend, I imagine. Are they going to affect your judgment?
My constituents, or rather my constituency association, reflected quite accurately the division within the Conservative Party in Parliament. My president, for example, backs Michael Heseltine. My chairman backed Mrs. Thatcher. And so it was right the way down to the bottom, which was just the same. Out in the street, they congratulated me for speaking my mind.
Could I label you as undecided?
I'm never undecided, but I do take a very cautious look at what's on offer.
Alan Clark, you as a minister, one presumes, and I imagine we're certain, you voted for Mrs. Thatcher, is that right?
Yeah, I did, but it's nothing to do with being a minister. I voted for her because I think she's been the best peacetime Prime Minister this century.
Now, how does her withdrawal affect you now?
Well, I'm shattered by it. I mean, we've someone who has won 3 elections running from an electorate of 30 million has been turned out by 150 people, most of whose names we don't know, because unlike Emma Nicholson, they didn't have the courage to say what they were doing.
That would signal, therefore, you're not immediately enamoured of Mr. Heseltine. What about the other two?
I think they are both excellent candidates. I entirely agree with what Tim Raisin said, that the need now is to unify the party. And I'm going to my constituency tomorrow, as most MPs will be doing, and I shall be talking to my constituents and trying to find out from them what their preference is.
I want to put this question to both you and Timothy Raisin. Let me ask you, would you have preferred Douglas Hurd and John Major, Alan Clark, to sort out a deal before running and put up one?
No, I would not, because I think one of the problems about this whole process has been this business of a deal and things being done in backstairs and smoke-filled rooms and so on. I think it's quite right that they should both put their names forward, and then the party can see how support for them divides. Because there's been quite enough backstairs dealing, and that's what's landed us in the mess we're in at the moment.
Mr. Raisin?
Well, I suppose I'd have preferred it if they'd got together and Douglas Hurd had come out of the hat, but I think Alan Clark is right in principle. I think what we've got before the party, what we didn't have in the first round, is a chance of a genuine choice. And I think on that we can actually build a great deal of support for whoever gets elected.
Emma Nicholson, it does seem to me, emerging from that room, is at least the sense that whatever happens, we have a problem with the way Mr. Heseltine is perceived by part of the party as somebody who brought some of this trouble about.
I don't regard elections as trouble. I regard them as breaking new ground and moving ahead. After all, we announce elections from Parliament and we give elections out for other people. We've now, if you like it, got a taste of our own medicine. And we are, if you like it, in the Conservative Party, in Parliament, the most sophisticated electorate in the world. The next few days are going to be fascinating, but I don't regard elections as trouble. They are a chance to do better in the future and to win the next general election.
Alan Clark, you don't sound very forgiving in the
We may be
dimension.
sophisticated, that's a matter of judgment. But what I don't like about it is this covert business. I mean, people should identify themselves. If they have the courage of their convictions, they should say what they're doing.
Oh, but you'd never bring about a change that way, would you? I mean, you've all got ministerial portfolios to think about. I mean, imagine if, in fact, you hadn't liked Mrs. Thatcher very much, but liked the portfolio. You wouldn't willingly go and put your head above the parapet, would you?
Oh, I think that underestimates the quality of members of the Conservative Party. I think they really do follow their consciences and their principles to a far higher degree than people realise. And their prime duty now is to unify the party. And I don't mind if that is done under Mr. Major or Mr. Hurd, but I want these wounds healed and I want it done soon.
Timothy Raisin, briefly, is it possible?
Well, I think it would be difficult for every minister to come out in the open unless they wanted to, but I think everybody else in the party should probably say quite openly who he or she is voting for, yes.
Timothy Raisin, Emma Nicholson and Alan Clark, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. After the break, tonight's other main news. Britain sends 14,000 more troops to the Gulf. Plus, the Thatcher years. Her opponents said she'd hijacked the party. Her supporters said she'd transformed the country. Whatever the truth, will her legacy last?
Some modern technology can be sort of confusing.
Right, this is a wobble-with. Everyone on the floor.
But not the Sony TR-75 with stereo sound.
Fill this bed.
It's so small.
Give it to me. That's it.
So light.
Push it through.
And so easy to operate. You'll find it hard to resist using it.
wherever you are. Amazingly, you can also plug it directly into your TV so you can enjoy instant playback with your friends. Sony, why compromise?
At night I dream of many things, some of which I plan and save for, some of which I achieve. When I was young, I wanted to see Africa, to run away. And so I traveled, but never left. My dream changed. I became us, became a family. And while dazzling things dazzle me still, my values hold dear other dreams. My home, my daughter's freedom to be, to achieve. My life with the men I still love. Simple dreams I dream, at night, during the day.
Here we are, the jolly old men at last, Jeeves, and there's a spiffing spot.
I would not advocate it, sir.
Jeeves, don't talk such rot. Onwards!
Very well, sir.
Ah, the tang of the salt breezes, Jeeves.
Yes, sir.
The gentle heaving of the waves.
Exactly, sir.
Yo-ho-ho, Jeeves. In fact, I'll go further. Yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of
Croft, sir.
Oh, Jeeves. Nothing like a splash of light, chilled Croft original dancing over the old taste buds. I feel absolutely in the pink, Jeeves.
I fear you're not alone, sir.
I say, Jeeves.
Croft Original, one instinctively knows when something is right.
Welcome back to this specially extended edition of Channel 4 News following Mrs Thatcher's announcement that she is to resign as Prime Minister. Here she is at number 10 live. She's just come out. She's there meeting, it seems, well-wishers on the doorsteps. Jolly rare that they're allowed... Oh, no, somebody works in there. And there she is, getting into her car. She'll be in Downing Street now until Tuesday at least. That's the first chance that there'll be another Prime Minister, another leader of the Conservative Party elected. At the back of her car with her is Peter Morrison, Parliamentary Private Secretary. The Jaguar sweeps off, this time through the Foreign Office gates and away. Well, we shall be bringing you the latest here on Channel 4 News until 8:30 this evening. Mrs Thatcher was the longest-serving Prime Minister this century, defeating Edward Heath to become party leader in 1975 and winning 3 successive general election victories. She cut the power of trade unions, reduced taxes and emphasised self-help. She took Britain to war to recapture the Falklands, but inflation wasn't tamed. The poll tax lost her votes and the party split over Europe. Nicholas Owen has been examining the Thatcher legacy.
Margaret Thatcher called up the words of that humble fellow St Francis to guide her actions as she became Prime Minister 11 years ago.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Well, how far were those promises in Downing Street fulfilled? The Thatcher era certainly had its share of conflict, though at least the first bout, the Falklands War, wasn't of her seeking. Argentina miscalculated her determination to defend the islands. In many eyes, victory ensured re-election in '83 and sealed her reputation as the toughest of political operators. That resolution showed itself clearly in the defeat of the striking mine workers, playing its part in her second general election success. By 1990, rioters in London were the most visible sign of protest against the poll tax. Opponents now saw resolution becoming inflexibility, bringing unpopularity at a bad time with the economy sagging. Almost no one loved Thatcher's community charge. An easy target, therefore, for Mr Heseltine to shoot at when he promised a new look at the poll tax, the introduction of which may turn out to have been Mrs Thatcher's single most serious error.
It is the issue which most Conservative MPs have been most worried about, if you leave aside the economy. And it's something which she is identified with. A little unfairly, I think, because in fact, unlike some other policies, it wasn't invented and pushed for entirely by her. Other people like Kenneth Baker and a whole raft of junior ministers have been involved with it. It became government policy. It wasn't actually intensively argued about in Cabinet before it happened, but it originated in her pledge many years ago to get rid of the rates, which she was embarrassed not to have fulfilled, and therefore she provided the sort of engine behind it.
This mother and grandmother preached old-fashioned values. What does a well-disposed philosopher see as the practical social impact of that?
People's recognition that the family is equally important to the rest of social life, that there are responsibilities that lie upon individuals and on parents to maintain the kind of life which they themselves would seek to lead. And I think people's dependence on vast organisations like trade unions and so on to do their living for them has greatly diminished.
The radical overhaul of the economy, attacking inefficiency, the trade unions, striving for low inflation, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, was the cornerstone of Thatcherism. Her critics think it wasn't only old-fashioned industry which seemed to get crushed along the way. Internationally, Mrs. Thatcher proved a doughty supporter and defender of traditional Western values. She spotted in Mr. Gorbachev a very different stamp of Soviet leader. His reform process provoked fundamental change in Eastern Europe. There, much of the credit went to the Iron Lady, widely admired in a way she might wish to have been nearer home. The Iron Lady found Western Europeans harder to get along with. Her hostility to issues like a common currency provoking the final crisis, with former allies talking publicly, not just of her misjudgments, but of failure to consult her cabinet. The one outstanding physical memorial of the Thatcher years will be the Channel Tunnel, binding Britain literally to her continental neighbours. An odd legacy, perhaps, for a conviction politician so distrustful of closer integration with the rest of Europe. Still, in that, as in many other things, Margaret Thatcher did tend to give voice to what many of her people thought. Events, however, have an awkward habit of overtaking, derailing the most dedicated radicals, even one who surely did achieve so much she'd set her heart on.
Nick Owen. World leaders have been generous in their tribute to Mrs. Thatcher, among them her friend and free market ally, the former US President Ronald Reagan, who said, through her bold and visionary policies, Margaret Thatcher restored Great Britain to prosperity and improved the quality of life for all her people. His successor, George Bush, had this to say in Saudi Arabia.
On a personal basis, I'll miss her because I value her counsel. I value her long experience, the wisdom that comes from her long experience, and she has been an outstanding Prime Minister for the United Kingdom and an outstanding friend of the United States.
She is going to be remembered as one of the first leaders who understood President Gorbachev and said that she can trust him, so it gave him just ammunition to approach other world leaders, and now we can say that everybody trusts him.
Sounds as though she's going to be missed.
In a way, yes.
I think an era of greatness has come to an end, but there are also new opportunities now for Great Britain to play a leadership role within the European integration process, and that is what I would expect from all of the candidates that are now running.
Volker Ruhr, the president of the ruling party in Germany. The president of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, has spoken of his high esteem for Mrs. Thatcher. The former Belgian Prime Minister, Willy de Klerk, said he hoped her resignation would end divisions within the community. From Strasbourg, our diplomatic editor, Nick Gowing, assesses the European view of the Prime Minister's resignation.
We just announced that to the Commission because they are in meeting now.
Within minutes of the resignation news reaching the Strasbourg press room, an EC official rushed through the warren of parliamentary corridors to pass the news to the European Commission, which so often had been the object of Mrs. Thatcher's scorn. The news shook those who had brushed so often with Mrs. Thatcher, but it electrified the parliamentary corridors. The message spread, Madame Thatcher has gone, and no one could quite believe it.
Who's running against Hazeltine? I don't know.
In the chamber, the 32 British Conservatives had long been marginalised here, even finding it difficult to do business with their centre-right political colleagues from other nations. Now they saw the straitjacket imposed from London being removed.
The views of the Prime Minister, stated so trenchantly, do have caused offence in the past. We all know that.
So what difference will the resignation make to your work here?
It will make an immense difference. I mean, even last week in Dublin, when I was with the Christian Democrats, 400 of them, I could see the difference simply because we were having a contest. And so I've no doubt it'll make an immense difference.
The question mark over our future in Europe and over our policies in Europe and over our attitudes in the intergovernmental conferences has been removed.
The jocular tone in the corridors confirmed the delight of most Tory MEPs, but as their leader, Christopher Prout, prepared to express the group's mood, half a dozen Tories pointedly declined comment. One told me, "I don't want to weep in public."
I think that Mrs. Thatcher's resignation is going to lead to a very strong European initiative from the British government in the intergovernmental negotiations, and that delights us all.
Jacques Delors, the European Commission President, kept a low profile and avoided the press. He had long had a frosty professional and personal relationship with Mrs. Thatcher. His proposals for economic and monetary union were at the heart of the row which eventually led to her resignation. In private today, he talked of his high esteem for Mrs. Thatcher. He also confessed to shock.
Why were you shocked? Were you not expecting it?
Such an emotion, because Mrs. Thatcher is an historical feature, you know.
Do you have any regrets about the way it's happened?
No comment, I repeat. Excuse me.
It was therefore left to his Vice President, Sir Leon Britton, to give the official Commission view on future EC relations with the United Kingdom.
To the end of the day, what matters is what policies Britain puts forward and the way in which they are put forward to her partners in the European community. And that we will not know until the time comes.
Would you expect a change of policy now, or a modification?
Well, it's impossible to answer that question until we see the outcome of the election and what is said by the winner.
Overnight, MEPs from the non-Thatcher camp and the other 11 nations had privately expressed despair that Mrs. Thatcher had declared she would fight on. Until the announcement came, members and officials at the highest level here had been warning of a two-speed Europe, 11-1 with Britain still the reluctant partner. Mrs. Thatcher's departure has left the pro-Europeans heartened, but not yet convinced of an enhanced British commitment to Europe.
Well, we shall return to Mrs. Thatcher's resignation and what happens next when we talk to our political editor, Eleanor Goodman, later in this programme. Now, with a brief summary of the rest of the day's news, here's Zeinab Badawi.
4 Scottish fishermen are believed to have drowned off the Isle of Arran after a Navy nuclear-powered submarine struck their boat. A submarine reported it had collided with the gear of a fishing vessel early this morning. Some hours later, the fishing boat Antares was reported missing and wreckage was spotted on the sea. The Royal Navy says the submarine is being inspected at Faslane Naval Base. Police investigating hooliganism among Manchester United soccer supporters have arrested 26 people in the Manchester area and other parts of the country. They'll appear before magistrates tomorrow. The Assistant Chief Constable of Manchester, who coordinated the investigation, said he thought they'd broken the back of the hooligan element following Manchester United. Abroad, in the Indian state of Punjab, 25 Hindus have been killed by Sikh extremists on the outskirts of the capital Chandigarh. The extremists are reported to have stopped 3 buses and shot some of the passengers at close range. Thousands of chanting Bulgarians have demanded the resignation of Prime Minister Andrei Lukanov after surrounding the Parliament building in Sofia. Bulgarian MPs are voting on an austerity budget, including heavy price rises. And the Danish Prime Minister, Paul Schlüter, has called an early general election for December the 12th. The move comes after negotiations broke down between his minority centre-right coalition and the opposition Social Democrats over his proposed tax reforms. In Germany, Helmut Kohl's Christian Democratic Party is being investigated for fraud just 11 days before the Chancellor fights the first all-German elections. The investigations focus on allegations that the CDU's now defunct East German sister party smuggled party funds abroad. The financial markets rose sharply on hearing of Mrs Thatcher's resignation, then fell back on the news that both Mr Hurd and Mr Major were standing to succeed her. By the end of the day, the index of 100 leading shares closed up just over 1.5 points. Against the dollar, the pound closed up under 0.5 cent, and sterling barely moved against the Deutschmark.
Amidst the drama of Mrs Thatcher's resignation, the government announced it is sending another 14,000 troops to the Gulf. Comprising another battalion and tank brigade, it will double Britain's force in the region. The Defence Secretary Tom King told the Commons the military build-up was the clearest possible message to Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait. Gabby Rado in London reports on Mr King's announcement and its implications.
The Desert Rats, men of the 7th Armoured Brigade, visited by the Defence Secretary Tom King last week, will soon be joined by soldiers of their sister brigade, the 4th Armoured, who are currently serving in Germany. And they'll have with them 60 more of the Challenger tanks, which will be so crucial in desert warfare, should it come to that, against Saddam Hussein's mass tank divisions. Amid today's drama, the Commons were expecting an announcement on troop reinforcements.
Together with further major American deployments and the continued build-up of units from 30 other countries in the multinational force, the deployment I have announced today is the clearest possible message to Saddam Hussein that there is a credible military option and that he must now observe Resolution 660, end his aggression, release the hostages and leave Kuwait.
It means really that the British forces are first of all going to be doubled in strength, and secondly they're going to be able to provide a full division which will be able to play a rather more independent role, be given its own operational task, and of course the troops in that division, all coming from the same army, will be that much more efficient because they've practiced and trained together for many years.
President Bush was visiting his troops in Saudi Arabia today to boost morale on the big US holiday Thanksgiving Day, when Americans traditionally share a meal with their families. Mr. Bush himself recently announced he was boosting his 250,000 troops by an extra 100,000. And the increasing likelihood of military action in the Gulf was discussed by world leaders in Paris this week, as Mrs. Thatcher disclosed in her Commons speech this afternoon.
But there is also a very widespread recognition among my colleagues in Paris that the time is fast approaching when the world community will have to take more decisive action to uphold international law and compel Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait.
In announcing the troop increases, the Defence Secretary added that they'd push up the cost of Britain's Gulf operation by £10 million a week, though he said Saudi Arabia was paying for food, transport and accommodation.
Gabby Rado reporting. Well, now let's go back down to Westminster to our political editor, Eleanor Goodman. What a day, Eleanor. You've been down there all day. Give us a sense of the mood.
Well, I think the Tory party has run through the full gamut of emotions today. This morning, when I first got here about 9:30, immediately after the news had been announced, there was a sense of real grief and bitterness on the right. There were grown men literally in tears. This afternoon, after the Prime Minister's speech, I think there was a great sense of sadness and a certain embarrassment at seeing a once towering woman reduced to that. But now the atmosphere has changed to relief, really, that I think a boil has been lanced. And if you like, normal competitive forces have been resumed, and the House of Commons lobby is like a kind of mock fair for potential prime ministers, with all the candidates wandering around, all their managers wandering around, talking politely to MPs. Because the thing is, this has thrown the whole thing open. All the old allegiances that Michael Heseltine thought he had in his back pocket now are being questioned. So every MP is being pursued. Somebody just said to me, I'll vote for the first one who says I'll divide the party. I'm sick of being told they'll all unite the party.
Well, we've had a sense on this programme by talking to backbenchers and to ministers and indeed to the contestants themselves that things are just beginning to move a bit. Do you get a real sense of hardening in anyone's direction?
Well, basically, if Michael Heseltine is to win, he must win on the second round, because if it went to a third round, it's almost certain that the system of second preference votes would help one of the compromise candidates, namely Hurd or Major. I have to say, we're in the business of the big momentum of the spin merchants. Though this is not going to be an acrimonious campaign, I think all the various campaign managers are saying their candidate has got the most momentum. And I have to say, the campaign managers who are saying that with most conviction are John Major's.
Well, Eleanor, I suppose I have to let you do a bit of trumpet blowing on such a night. Who tipped John Major first?
2 years ago, and I've got 12 to 1 on Douglas Hurd 4 years ago.
Oh, I've got 10 to 1 on him, but only last week. Never mind. Eleanor, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Westminster. Well, just to recap the remarkable developments today, Mrs Thatcher has announced she will not contest the next round of the Tory leadership election. She's been to see the Queen, and she has said that she will resign as Prime Minister as soon as another leader is elected. The Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd and the Chancellor of the Exchequer John Major have both joined Michael Heseltine in a bid to succeed her. The next from ITN will be news at 10. That will be at 10 o'clock and will be a specially extended programme. Next from Channel 4 will be at 10:45, A Week in Politics. We shall, of course, be back tomorrow night with a special edition of Channel 4 News, special in the sense that it will bring you just about everything you need to know, but at the end of a day in which this channel has brought you something like 6.5 hours on this remarkable day, that's Channel 4 News. I suppose one has to end by saying a day is a long time in politics. Good evening.